Good afternoon. I'm Al McFarlane. Welcome to the Conversation with Al McFarlane. I'm glad to be here and glad to have you along as well. Well, today is Thursday, August 28th, 2024. We're knee-deep in the Minnesota State Fair and in funny weather. I mean, just beautiful one day, idyllic one day, and then all hell breaks loose with wind and rain and tree damage. And then we're back to beautiful again. So hopefully the rest of the week it'll be beautiful. Hopefully, there's a beautiful story about the weather wherever you are around the world. The climate is showing itself, and I think we have to sort of claim some responsibility for what we do that does not support healthy climate, healthy environment, and the principles of regeneration and sustainability. Well, love to have your thoughts on those matters. Any of them, actually. Talk about the state fair, talk about the climate, talk about the weather, the storms, talk about politics. Politics, that's what's on my mind today. And in particular, I want to focus on the upcoming presidential elections. I pulled a couple of articles, one from Le Monde and one from NPR, that talk about the question of the Biden-Harris and now Harris-Walz attitude, policies towards Palestine and Gaza and the Israeli war against the Palestinians in Gaza, against Hezbollah, or against Hamas, as they say. So we'll go over that today. Before I start, I want to invite you all who are listening to tell somebody else that we're live right now. And you may be on LinkedIn or on YouTube, either of the YouTube platforms, Insight News or Black Press USA. You could be checking us out on Facebook or Twitter. And however you connect, we appreciate you. We thank you for being a part of this. We want you to help us grow our audience, grow our people that are connecting with this program, The Conversation with Al McFarlane. What you can do is go to YouTube MN and YouTube / Insight News MN. And that's our YouTube platform and channel. Simply subscribe, like, and share. And that puts you where you can get regular notifications, helps us grow our subscriber base. We want to get to 2,000. We're past 1,000 now. Help us grow by becoming a subscriber and asking your friends, telling your friends and your networks to also check us out and see if we're a fit for their information diet. Well, as an incentive, as I mentioned, we've got some seasons tickets to the Minnesota Twins baseball. And if you are interested in winning a pair of tickets to a game, can be for September, sometime in the month of September, just drop a comment. The comment has to come in through the YouTube channel, YouTube Insight News Minnesota, where you subscribe. And as a subscriber, you can just put a comment saying baseball, and then you'll be eligible for a drawing for a pair of tickets to a home game in the month of September. We'd love to have you be part of the family, and we want you to enjoy Minnesota Twins baseball. My friend and colleague Ndugu Yusef Mjini is here. Yusef, good afternoon. Welcome again. We had a good conversation yesterday, but we go today again. And thank you so much for being available and for joining us. People tell me that Yusef Mjini, he's a walking encyclopedia. So your reputation precedes you all the time. And I'm fortunate to be a friend of yours and to have a chance to connect and kick it with you as we do on the conversation.
Thank you, Al. It's a pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
Sure. Well, let's jump right in. I want to pull up one of the two articles that I mentioned earlier. One is from Le Monde, and this one is one from, published on August 24th. That's when it first was published. The headline was Kamala Harris sticks to Biden's line on Gaza, disappointing the pro-Palestinian left. The subtitle is Pro-Palestinian Activists from the Uncommitted Movement were virtually sidelined at the Democratic Convention, although they were able to establish contacts with leaders. The story is by Piotr Smolar, who is a Washington correspondent for Le Monde, the French newspaper. And the article says Kamala Harris's style, her origins, and the enthusiasm she's aroused since the beginning of her campaign all point to a break with Joe Biden. But when it comes to foreign policy, the continuity between the president and his vice president seems complete. It was enough to listen to Harris's speech to the Democratic delegates at the convention in Chicago on Thursday, August 22nd, particularly the weighty passage on the war in Gaza. She said she recalled the administration's relentless efforts to push Israel and Hamas for a ceasefire and the release of hostages still being held in the landlocked and tortured Strip. According to her, this is the condition for the Palestinians to realize their right to dignity, security, freedom, and self-determination. Close quote. That last principle is today denied and rejected by the Israeli government, dominated by far-right supremacists. But Harris did not distance herself in any way from this unreliable partner, which abuses the unconditional support of the U.S. She made no reference to a possible suspension of arms deliveries to Israel, called for by many Democratic activists in states with large Arab Muslims communities. So I'll stop there. That's the beginning. You can read more, but that's the opening of the article. Yusuf, let's talk about that. What are your thoughts?
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, there are several things, Al, and I hope during the course of the program we will get to the numbers that the Associated Press has published about what's really happening in Gaza that is not being publicized. Three things. One, the Israel-Palestine war is second only to the presidential elections in terms of its divisiveness within the United States. There are people clearly on both sides of this issue, including Christian Zionists, including people on the left, progressives, Democrats, and people in the Republican Party. Secondly, Kamala Harris, in her role as vice president, has not really enjoyed the opportunity to develop and to promote her own independent positions on foreign policy and international issues, such as the crisis in Palestine, Israel. And three, Biden was very clear in his push for a ceasefire. However, he remained right of center in terms of continuing support for Israel. He spoke about limiting arms sales to Israel if the collateral deaths in Gaza didn't cease and they didn't make greater headway. Anthony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, who himself is Jewish, has made a dozen trips to the Middle East, not just to Palestine, Israel, but to Saudi Arabia and other countries in the region to try and broker what at times seemed like a very likely, ceasefire peace process that somehow continues to fall off the rails just before it's expected to be implemented. But during the Democratic National Convention, the pro-Palestinian people, including the protesters, including people within the Democratic Party, were sidelined, as was pointed out in the Le Monde article in the New York Times and the Washington Post, from being able to address the convention, although there were members of families who were still being held hostage in Gaza. And the vice president herself has been criticized by the Republican Party for not sitting down with reporters and answering tough questions about domestic, international, and foreign relation issues. Now, the vice president herself has spoken very strongly in support of Israel's right to exist and to defend itself. But when it came to the 40,000 deaths, the 92,000 plus people injured, her comment at the Democratic National Convention was that that was heartbreaking, but nothing any stronger in terms of, other than how nice it would be to have a ceasefire and continued peace talks. Benjamin Netanyahu has stated publicly on repeated occasions that there will be no two-state solution in his time within the borders of Israel-Palestine. And again, Kamala has not had the opportunity to develop and to publicize her own opinions beyond the comments that were made at the Democratic National Convention. Let me just deal with some of the issues other than the 1,000 deaths, 62% of whom, according to the Associated Press, have been women and children. More than 93,000 people injured in the West Bank during the assault by Israel. 284 aid workers, 500 health workers, and 113 journalists have also lost their lives during the strife in Gaza, which again doesn't receive the same amount of publicity. 60% of the buildings and the homes in Gaza have been destroyed. 85% of the school buildings, 23 hospitals, 500,000 people, according to the United Nations, are facing catastrophic food shortages, hunger, dying from hunger, starving in Gaza. 65% of the roads, and of course the early casualties in the aerial bombardment were the water plants, the electricity plants, the infrastructure, the roads. 65% of the roads in Gaza have just literally been destroyed. And by the same token, the Walls-Harris campaign has raised more than $500 million, $540 million to be exact, in the month since Minnesota Governor Tim Walz has been handpicked by Harris as her vice presidential candidate. So we're seeing a sudden shift in the polls since Biden has, many say, patriotically stepped down and endorsed Kamala Harris and now Tim Walz. But this issue is simmering in the Middle East. There are demonstrations occurring around the globe and across the United States, calling for a ceasefire, calling for immediate peace talks, and calling for an end to what many view as the unnecessary and wanton deaths and injuries of so many innocent Palestinian people who reside in Gaza. So many people are concerned about an all-out war in the Middle East, Iran taking the point on one side and Israel with the backing of the United States on another. The United States has moved aircraft carriers, soldiers, weapons. The United States already funds 20% of Israel's military budget, and last year alone, Congress gave Israel twice the amount that they were requesting in terms of military aid. So in many ways, shapes, and forms, the United States could easily be drawn into a Middle East conflict, and it could spread, with support from Russia, from China, from Iran, who's got 800 million people, who has one of the largest armed forces in the region, military equipment, rockets, and tremendous firepower. We could see the loss of tens of thousands of additional people who would lose their lives in and out of uniform, including settlers, including Israeli citizens, and including Palestinians. So
you threw a number out that I wasn't familiar with. 800,000 population. Who was that in reference to?
No, Iran. It's got far more than that.
That's their 800. Is it? That's so okay. I'm thinking you said that was their population, 800 million, which you said 800,000 probably soldiers.
I may have misspoken that. No,
okay.
They've got one of the largest populations in the Middle East, okay, and one of the largest armed forces, air forces, and active duty soldiers ready for combat, well trained.
Let's check
well
that.
armed and ready for combat. Yeah,
We'll check that number. Let me go to the other story that I pulled up, and we'll just continue the conversation, Youssef.
sure.
And this was a piece that was presented a day before the one from Le Monde. This was published on August 23rd around midday from National Public Radio. And again, it's reaction to or reporting on the convention and Harris's speech accepting the Democratic Party nomination in a formal way for the office of president. The headline: Harris says Israel has right to defend itself. Palestinians need dignity, security. And it's a byline story by Jacqueline Diaz. And I'll just read a few paragraphs of this as well. After much speculation, Vice President Harris, now the Democratic nominee for president, came out with the strongest remarks so far on where she stands on the Israel-Hamas war and the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Let me be clear, she said, I will always stand up for Israel's right to defend itself, and I will always ensure Israel has the ability to defend itself, close quote. She said that Israelis should never again go through the horror and the unspeakable acts of October 7th. At the same time, what has happened in Gaza in the past 10 months is devastating. This is the vice president again. She said, so many innocent lives lost. The scale of suffering is heartbreaking. She and President Biden are still pushing for a ceasefire deal that sees the hostages released, the fighting in Gaza to end, and so that Palestinian people can realize their right to dignity, security, freedom, and self-determination. That again, a quote. Previously, Harris had not differed far from Biden's position on Israel and Gaza since the onset of the war. The Biden administration has stood steadfastly with Israel, which has included continued military aid to the country despite continued pro-Palestine marches across the country and at the Democratic National Convention. The article goes on to say that Harris previously met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and said at the time that she held an unwavering commitment to Israel, but that she would not be silent about the humanitarian issues of Gaza. Trump, the article says, posted that she hates Israel and wouldn't even show up to Congress for Netanyahu's session on his Truth Social account during her speech. Well, that's their take on what happened. So Youssef, what was the impact, in your point of view, of the continued protests? Some would say unsuccessful protests by the pro-Palestinian community activists at the DNC. But how do you evaluate their strategy and their impact?
A correction, two facts. One, the population of Iran is 89 million plus.
Okay.
Number two, Kamala refused to support any of the discussions about restricting arms sales to Israel if they didn't take a stronger stance in terms of a ceasefire and the release of the hostages. Kamala clearly was echoing statements that the Biden administration had been making all along, the Secretary of State, the President, and again, refused to support any of the discussions about restricting arms sales to Israel if they didn't discontinue the sort of wanton, and they're not using smart bombs, they're using dumb bombs, 500-pound bombs that are leveling buildings to the ground, hospitals, schools, refugee camps, tents, aid workers. The collateral damage is devastating in terms of some of the deaths and injuries that I mentioned earlier. I think Kamala is, Jim Hightower used to say the only thing in the middle of the road are dead armadillos and yellow stripes. And I think Kamala is very carefully treading the middle of the road, a centrist position, very strongly supportive of Israel, the right to defend themselves, the right to exist, and the loss of life and hunger and devastation in Gaza being heartbreaking. In terms of the pro-Palestinian presence in Chicago,
Well,
it turned out to be.
before you go on, you said, so what choice does she really have? Let me ask you to sit. When you think about that, think of her position and the dynamics of the national politics and the dynamics of the international question, our relationships with Israel. What would you say are the realistic options for her? And has she not chosen the very best, or could she do something differently, either to the left or to the right? What do you think?
Well, the United States is the strongest ally that Israel has, and therefore has a bully pulpit and pays for 20% of the cost of their annual military budget. And, despite Netanyahu's fierce disrespect for the leadership of the United States, having appeared in Congress twice without the invitation of the White House, and telling people that we can do it with or without the United States, doesn't make any difference in our position. Clearly, the man has been brought up on charges of corruption and bribery, and as long as the war continues, he will not be in court having to face those charges. And as soon as the conflict is over, he will. So it's clearly to his advantage to continue the war until there is no Gaza or West Bank or Palestine anymore. And one of the fears about the flattening of the buildings, the roads, the infrastructure, is that there will be new settlements built, as is currently happening on the West Bank, in Gaza as well, for Jewish citizens of Israel, not for Palestinian people whose homes have just been absolutely destroyed. Now, in terms of choice, there's always a choice, not diplomatically, in terms of what Congress will do, what the United Nations will do, what the International Court will do, that has declared that Israel and Hamas are both guilty of war crimes and ought to be, charged with those war crimes. Kamala, I think, is still in the process of developing what her administration's policies are going to be, what her foreign policies are going to be, and is getting advice from all sides that has not yet gelled. So I think that the course that she's chosen, to be silent, to be cautious, to be careful, not to throw a wrench into the campaign, is their number one concern. They want to get her elected. They don't want her going too far left or right, because there's a large Islamic, Muslim, Middle Eastern population in the United States that have a high voting percentage.
And in battleground states as well. Yeah.
Yeah. And because the race is so tight, one side is going off the rails, the other side is doing everything humanly possible to stay on the rails. So I don't look for any radical or earth-shaking proclamations unless the Democratic campaign finds its back up against the wall and has to choose sides and come out very forcefully. Now, you've also got the issue of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who some suspect may have banged his head in a car accident, has suspended his campaign and come out and endorsed the Republican endorsed candidate for president. His name will continue to be on the ballot in Minnesota and 19 other states. And whether this will hurt Kamala or hurt, the MAGA people remains to be seen. His support in the national polls has basically plundered since Kamala and Tim Walz have been out on the hustings. And in half of the swing states, the Walz-Harris campaign is, just booming in terms of fundraising. They've had over 50,000 volunteers have called and volunteered. What can we do in our local community, in our state? And one final note on Robert Kennedy that Cooper Mitchell brought up is that Kennedy met with Trump and said he would endorse him if Trump would promise him a cabinet position in his administration. He then tried to broker a meeting with Walz and Harris, and they said, "Look, you've already pulled your pants down in the Trump campaign. What makes you think we'd want to meet with you anyhow?" So they refused to meet with him, and as a
Smart.
result, he suspended his campaign and is endorsing Trump. But it's you know it's a very close race. This race is expected to be among the closest ever. One, because of the Harris-Walz late start and the fact that we didn't have primaries, we didn't have a dusting of 18 Democratic or Republican candidates vying for the endorsement, and with only about 6 weeks left before the November 5th elections, I think everybody's walking on eggshells.
Well, let's look at some of the elements and get your thoughts. I'm going to raise some questions, and you can just respond, or just kick it back. But I want to think about what the traditional perception is of the opportunity and the power of the Black community in this election, what that perception is. I think that has to go back to what happened with the Obama election in 2008, and the massive turnout in the succeeding election as well. Motivated, inspired by Obama, Black people showed up and we voted, and it made a difference, and it gave us a sense of our power at the same time. The same question, I think, is being put forth in the marketplace right now. How do we organize, and how do we recapture and expand that excitement? And there's evidence that that has happened and is happening based on within hours of the Kamala Harris announcement. Millions poured in to the campaign, but
$1.5 billion.
Notably, millions identified as coming from Black people as well, from Black women and Black men. That's unique and new.
There was a Zoom meeting of Black women, and there were 40,000 Black women on that Zoom. Okay, pledging, volunteering, signing up to vote, supporting the Harris-Walz ticket. A week later, there was a national Zoom meeting of Black men, and there were almost 50,000 Black men on that Zoom call doing the same thing. Pledging, making commitments, volunteering, requesting early ballots, etc. But the closeness of this race, Al, means that any one of 4 or 5 different constituencies could make the difference. Not just, remember, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, but Donald Trump won the electoral vote. Okay? And as a result, Hillary Clinton lost the election and Donald Trump won. And that's why there's all this discussion about Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, Arizona, the red states. And by that same token, it's the red states, it's the Black states, it's Georgia is at play. Okay, Minnesota, when Biden was still in the race, was not considered red or blue, it was considered purple. And they said it could go either way. Now, I haven't seen any of the projections or the polls on Minnesota since then, but I think clearly with Tim Walz being the number 2 person on the ticket, that the Trump people are not going to spend a lot of money in Minnesota to try and win it over. Okay. But, you've got the Latino vote, you've got the Asian vote, you've got the Muslim vote, you've got the Christian right, you've got the Christian Zionist, you've got the hard butt Democrats, the ones who always vote. And then you've got the MAGA people. So you've got all these different constituencies heading for a logjam, and the winner will be determined by who gets the highest number of votes out and who gets the largest number of electoral votes. Not just from swing states that could go either way, but across the country. California's got 40 million people. I think, North Dakota, South Dakota, Idaho, Montana combined don't have that many people. Okay, and you could throw in another Utah, a half dozen states. So Kamala Harris being, from California, but in the past, we've seen winners declared before the polls on the West Coast or in the mountain states closed. And so that's kind of shaky. Everybody's anxious to be number one to get out there, other than declaring, that Dewey wins when he didn't. But the polls close at 9 o'clock on the East Coast, which is 6 o'clock on the West Coast, and a lot of people are still getting off work, going to vote. We're talking 40 million people, but the networks will call the election as early as possible, and hopefully people won't get discouraged by what they hear, depending on whether they listen to Fox or whether they listen to MSNBC, and say it either doesn't make sense for me to vote, or we've already won or lost. There's no reason for me to go and vote now anyhow. Couple this with the fact that for the past several years, in states that were controlled by Republican legislatures, there were efforts to suppress the vote, to block drop boxes, to block early ballots, mail-in ballots in 38 states in this country. And in North Carolina, the judge said even Ray Charles could see that this effort was intended to prevent Black people from going to the polls and exercising their right to the franchise, and that happened all across this country. So we still don't know what that impact will be. And in Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi and in many states and urban areas, people had to stand in line for 6, 8, 10 hours, Al, in order to vote. And so the legislatures passed laws saying you can't pass out bottled water or donuts to people who are standing in line because they're hungry.
Right.
Crazy. So, and I want to say this in conclusion. Donald Trump has pointed out on 2 occasions in the past 6 weeks that this may be the last election in this country, national election, that white people are actually able to win. Okay? Now, talk about playing the race card. My goodness gracious.
Go into that some more. What do you say? I mean, I heard 2 versions of it. One is what you just described, but I also heard the version that says, if you vote for me, MAGA world, you won't, and you talk particularly to the Christian evangelicals,
right. Mm-hmm.
You won't have to worry about voting again in the future. What did that mean? What was he saying?
Well, he was saying that he would like to call a constitutional convention if we elect 34 Republican governors and make him king for life. Okay, that he wants to eliminate the 2-term limit on presidents and the 4-year term. And he said he would be a dictator on day one. He would release all of the people, the 1,000 people in jail for the January 6th insurrection.
Mm-hmm.
If you recall, the final month, January, the first 20 days in January of his last term, he was giving out pardons to people who would donate $5 million to his reelection campaign, Stop the Steal. And half of those people have gone back to jail for committing the same crimes that they were in jail for in the first place. And there was very little publicity about the people he was pardoning wholesale, who would make $5 million contributions to Stop the Steal or to his presidential campaign.
And they went back to jail?
Elon Musk has pledged $41 million a month to Donald Trump's presidential campaign or political affairs committees who are working to get him elected. $41 million every month until the election. And he did that in late June, early July. So I think both sides are serious as cancer.
Listen, our friend Jonathan Palmer has joined us. Jonathan, come on in the room here. How you doing, my friend?
I am good.
JP.
Good to see you both. Wonderful to see you, Yusef and Al.
Let me drop a tough question on you to get you in here, because we were talking about this whole thing of the awesomeness of the excitement in the Black community about the Kamala Harris selection as the Democratic candidate for president, and how 40,000 Black women, 50,000 Black men were on these two calls, but that's sort of symptomatic of this energy that's alive and flourishing and growing in our community. But I wanted you and us to look at how our community is navigating difficult issues, difficult relationships. And this kind of follows up on the questions I asked you, Seth, earlier about how the campaign is going to respond to the quote unquote sides in the Palestine, Israel, or Israel Gaza conflict. And so the question is, what is the relationship? How do Black people see their interest one way or the other, or if at all, in discussing the Palestine-Israel question? What do you mean? I think everybody would admit and acknowledge, it's not an admission, it's acknowledgement, there's been a substantially positive historic relationship between the Black community and an activist Jewish community in this country, active in the civil rights movement, active locally, nationally, historically. On the other hand, we don't have the same experience with the Palestinian community as Black Americans, but we do in the sense that we understood how Nelson Mandela, for example, rallied to support the liberation and freedom and the self-reliance of the Palestinian community based on the fact that there was a sense of reciprocity with the anti-apartheid struggle and Palestinian allies. So how do you see us navigating that? And is the Palestine question, how does that sit with our community versus or alongside the question of women's rights? The removal of Roe v. Wade by the Republican, the courts issue. How does it sit alongside the issue of continued economic investment that we have been looking for? How do we weigh all that and bring it to the attention of the campaigns in ways that firmly clarify what we identify as our interest internationally and locally? So what are your thoughts? It's a lot, but jump in, Jonathan.
So just the easy questions right there off the bat. I think I think Kamala Harris did a really good job of kind of threading the needle of that, of addressing and saying that the United States will always support Israel, make sure that they have what they need to protect and defend themselves, but also needs to move for an immediate ceasefire. And I think it's a mistake to equate Israel with Jewish people as a whole. I've got lots of Jewish friends who have not been very happy with the actions, have not been very happy with Bibi, and so it is not. It's not exactly the same thing. There is interest. There are many Jewish people who have ties to Israel, and Israel is an important piece, but it is not. You can't just add them that if you're not supporting Israel, that means you don't support Jewish people, or vice versa.
Okay.
Jonathan,
Yep.
there are a number of people, Jewish people in Israel, who are opposed to the policies of
Yes.
the Netanyahu government. And they have come out in the tens of thousands demonstrating against his attacks on the Supreme Court and the policies that the right-wing government is implementing. So, I would say not just Israel, but the Israeli government,
Yes.
particularly the right-wing leadership, the leading party in the Knesset, who is dictating and defining the terms of the situation both in the West Bank and in Gaza. So you're absolutely correct. Jewish Voice for Peace, many rabbis, many Jewish organizations are calling for an immediate ceasefire and an end to the destruction and the wanton collateral deaths in Gaza.
And I think that's very similar to our own community here in the United States. I mean, we all are Americans. We love our country, but that doesn't mean we agree with the government on every decision they made. And especially, you can look at the government during the Trump years, very much opposed to that. You can look at the history in this country that shows you when the government has taken actions that the people of this country have been against. So you can never just simply call it an Israel-Palestinian thing. Part of the challenge, I think, then is getting to that point of everything gets so bound up together. You got to choose a side. It's either Israel, Palestine. It doesn't have to be that clear cut. I think you can want Israel to be able to support itself from any attacks, and especially the attack that started all of this, but at the same time want Palestinian lives to be preserved, saved, protected. It doesn't have to be an either or if you have a consistent ethic of life. If you were about everybody should have a place to live that is safe, everybody should be able to be free from government making decisions and going to war over them, and not involving their own interests, but utilizing them as collateral within the middle of power struggles. It is amazing to me that as we look at this, I've always heard about how tactical the Mossad was and how able and capable and everything. And yet we do carpet bombing instead of strategic infiltration or things along those lines.
So you question the intent.
I question the intent, and I question the actions. It is there is a need to preserve the sanctity of life for all people. And when you have bad actors, going ahead, Hezbollah has been horrible and needs to be stopped. But how do you do that in a way that does not sacrifice your own morals and values at the same time? And I think the wanton bombing of any community in any place is part of the issue here. And the hostages, which are not just Jewish people, there's Palestinians as well as that. All of them want the people to come home. So the focus doesn't seem to be as strongly on that as it does to be on power struggle and winning a battle. And so I think part of the issue is a little more education for our communities, a little more understanding. And I think the young people have a really strong grasp on some of those pieces. There's a lot more activity happening at that level. There is also, unfortunately, a lot more sectionism. So, just drawing over of sides. And this is not a simple situation where you just go and we've got to just do this one thing. It's a balancing act that's very tough in that. How do you go ahead and preserve that freedom and that support for Israel, but at the same time, protect the lives of Palestinians and make sure everybody can get through this in the best way possible?
So what's going to be the impact of the squad? For example, Ilhan Omar is one of the principals identified as the progressive, ultra progressive wing, and actually carrying the banner for the two-state solution for Palestine and for the Palestinian side in the Israel Hamas conflict, as I see it.
I found it interesting, Al, that the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC, did not provide funding for Don Samuels in his primary race against Ilhan.
Talk about
Omar.
that, yeah.
And I think that the squad has provided an important alternative voice on, foreign affairs in Congress. and I think within their own constituencies and geographic locations. So the best choices are the most well informed. And with 6 companies controlling 90% of the television and radio stations and newspapers in the United States, it's growing increasingly difficult to obtain, informed choices and information. But they've been consistent. They only lost one member in the primary elections, and they both. Keith Ellison earned 25,000 votes in the 5th Ward when he ran for Congress. Ilhan Omar won 75,000 votes, and her troops marched and knocked on doors 5 times in that 5th congressional district. So they know how to campaign, and they're very sophisticated. They're not going away anytime soon.
Jonathan?
And I think that I agree with Yusef, and part of the opportunity there is strong voices in Congress that can serve as advisors to our future Madam President, and be able to ensure that a discussion around the issue is including all sides. If you're gonna get down to actual solutions or strategies that make sense, you can't ignore a part, even if you disagree with it. You got to at least hear it so you understand the rationale. And there may be a piece that you're missing. There may be a piece that you're not fully informed about. But at very least, you understand where somebody on the other side of an argument is coming from, and you can adjust your thinking as necessary in order to come up with a solution that can work for everybody. Even if it's not everybody's preferred thing, it can be something that everybody can compromise on, everybody can live with. So I think they provide, a very valuable voice and a very valuable voice of counsel. Even if I don't agree necessarily with everything that they say, I still value what they say and the fact that they've got so much energy and are brave enough, to stand forward and say, these are the things that we think are important and need to be heard about.
Let me ask you to put your future lenses on and presume that Harris Biden are victorious. That ticket is victorious in the election. How does Harris Waltz? Yeah, thank you. How does our community mobilize itself differently to both support and take advantage of the transition? And I want you to answer that or discuss it, reflecting on how we had created expectations when Barack Obama became president, and whether or not we feel that we were reasonable and that our expectations were answered or fulfilled or not. What should we be looking at in terms of organizing and articulating and advancing the interest of the Black community in a successful Harris Waltz presidential bid?
Jonathan, go ahead.
I think that we're in a very unique position here in Minnesota on that, and especially the African American community. I mean, with Governor Walz being such a good friend to, I think, Minnesota as a whole, but he has worked really well, I think, with communities of color. He's been engaged with the African American community. When I was leading Halley, he had me convene a group of African American leaders to talk about input for the budget and for issues of priorities. So he is somebody who I think cares about and recognizes the importance of the issues. Kamala Harris, Howard University, aka, I think our interests are going to be represented. I think there is a mistake people sometimes fall into, which is that everything, the moment you get somebody who looks like you or is part of your group, now you're going to get everything that you've ever wanted. That's not the case. The case is we know that there's going to be people there who are going to advocate for our interest, who are going to push for the policies and put forward the strategies that will benefit our community and support our community, and that they will listen to the concerns and address those. I think that was a mistake that was done with Barack Obama. I think there were some in our community that had this expectations that we were going to get reparations right off the bat. I mean, that is a huge conversation that has to go through several layers in order to get things done. And I think a lot of times people don't understand politics is not just, I want this, you represent me, and there it's going to be able to make. Congress has both sides. You've got to get the majority votes to get something through. So there's always these levels of compromise and pushback, and you have to think of it more as pulling things forward on a bus than going ahead and taking a speeding car to get to the end finish line.
Yusef?
I'd like to shout out to Michelle Delicious, who is a loyal listener to the Conversation with Al McFarlane. Politicians are concerned about one of two things: what you can do to them or for them. And we're going to have to turn out the vote if we expect anything, because we may be the first state in the country that has an Indigenous woman in the governor's office. And will Bobby Joe Champion step up and become lieutenant governor? I mean, we've got to win over Amy Klobuchar. We got to win over Tina Smith. We got to win over our congressional representatives. And, politicians look at who helped them get to where they're at. Okay. And what every first term or existing incumbent wants is another term in office. I don't care how old they get. Okay. Joe Biden is a good example, 50 years in Congress or the presidency. And if we don't turn out and get these people elected, we cannot expect them to do our bidding or even to solicit our input when they make major decisions that have an effect in our communities. So we've got to register people. We've got to do the early voting. We've got to get out there. We've got to make contributions. We got, lawn signs don't vote, but they let people know that you're an active participant in the process.
Mm-hmm.
And driving through the hood, I'd like to see some lawn signs in black folks' yards too, not just white people who are politically active or other ethnic groups. And that says something to our neighbors. We got to get our kids, we got to get our cousins, we got to get our awkward uncles and everybody else to the polls, because of all of the efforts that are being directed at us to prevent us from participating in the electoral process. So, what goes around comes around. We got to go around.
There's one more piece to raise. I think there's a piece of getting out and talking with your neighbors and educating people. We, my alumni group, Morehouse and Spelman, we're having a discussion last week about black men who are supporting Trump. And if you saw that little setup thing,
12% the last time he ran.
Right. And you're like, well, how or why? And some of the discussions have to be with things that, again, not understanding how a tax policy works. There are people who are supporting because they believe that I'm going to get a tax rebate and get some money back. Donald Trump is not doing tax cuts for people making under $100,000.
Yeah,
yes,
not at all.
And so there's a lot of discussion that needs to be had to educate people in our community and help them understand exactly what is at stake, but also what they think they're going to get from somebody being in office versus what they will actually get from somebody being in office.
Let me localize that discussion. You both know Governor Walz, and I think you both know Peggy Flanagan, Lieutenant Governor. And as you mentioned, Yusef, if that ticket is successful, Peggy Flanagan becomes governor. Bobby Joe Champion likely becomes the lieutenant governor. What does that mean for our community? And I'm likening or connecting the fact that Tim Walz selected and ran with and succeeded with Peggy Flanagan, a Native American woman, on his ticket, and seeing what Biden has done, I hold those in the same regard, Biden's endorsement and selection of Kamala Harris as vice president, but his endorsement of her
Ketanji Brown
for president.
to the Supreme Court.
That's awesome. That's all, and that as well. But what does it mean for Minnesota when Peggy Flanagan and Bobby Joe potentially emerge as governor, lieutenant governor? What does it mean for the organizations that you are affiliated with, and for the interest that we've worked on in this market? Yusef and then Jonathan?
Well, the governor prepares his or her own budget, and the legislature does the same. And that's where the compromise takes place. So with an indigenous person and an African American in the governor's office, at least our concerns will not be silent or fall by the wayside. Now, that does not mean that we will get, everything that we want. The governor does have veto power, but not the power to automatically, pass bills. But we've seen, for example, from Governor Walz, where he provided resources and support to North Minneapolis to try and end some of the senseless killing that the youngsters were doing in the drive-by shootings, et cetera. So there are ways. And the people who run the 8 or 10 state departments, the 6,000 or 8,000 employees, report to the governor and or to the lieutenant governor. So that would mean a greater opportunity for economic participation in the state in terms of contracts, in terms of consultants, in terms of other economic opportunities, because the state is an incredible economic engine. Okay, number one. Number two, the Department of Education reports to the governor, the commissioner, and we could have influence in every state department that there is and every commissioner. We could also presumably have some influence in making recommendations for who ought to hold some of those commissioners' positions. Public safety, education, deed, the list goes on and on. And that would greatly help us to no end.
Jonathan, what are your thoughts?
Well, I agree with everything Yusef said. So what I'll just add is the inspirational effect. I've known the lieutenant governor for years. She is a great person. Our daughters are both named Siobhan. And I think of her daughter seeing what her mother achieves. I think of young indigenous boys and girls seeing that. I think of young African-American boys and girls seeing her and seeing Bobby Joe Champion. I think of all kids being able to see this, see what is possible, and then normalize that. So it doesn't become a novelty or a first-time thing. It becomes something that is achievable and possible, and the inspirational effect that can have across the country for kids in communities to be able to look up and see themselves reflected in government and to be able to achieve those dreams.
A la Keith Ellison.
Yes.
That's another thing that is important to me. I'm looking at the governor's cabinet, or the 5 constitutional officers, assuming that Governor Walz gets to Washington. You'll have Peggy as governor, Bobby Joe as lieutenant governor, and then Keith Ellison as the AG. 2 other positions, Secretary of State and the auditor, make up the 5 elected leaders of our state. 3 of those being people of color, unprecedented, amazing. And I think that signals a sea change, and it opens the door. It signals to our communities broadly that it's time for more voices, more ideas, more diversity, more access. And the normalization of that, as you put it, Jonathan, is something that we should expect. Final words, Yusef?
Plus the appointments to the commissions and the other authorities that the governor's office has.
Jonathan, 20 seconds.
I just think that this is great. And also, Michelle Delicious Delights has been a poll judge in Maryland for the last 2 years. So go, Michelle. Keep doing that. That's
Applause. Well, listen, brothers, thank you so much. Been a good conversation as always. And
Thank you.
we'll see you next time. Take care.